The Cardano community just pulled off something incredible. We overruled the rulers. We invalidated the biggest validators. Everyone knew the Cardano community was strong, but I'm not sure if anyone knew it was this powerful. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss the conclusion of the SPO phase of the Cardano Foundation poll, why the result was so shocking, and how there's still a little bit more work to do in terms of redelegation. If this image makes you uncomfortable because it's completely unclear if these are revolutionaries marching toward decentralization, or if they're just a bunch of homeless guys who found some flags, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Look at this, guys. I meant it when I said that this is incredible. This is pretty shocking for this to happen anywhere in the crypto world. So the option that cuts against the economic interests of the biggest validators in our blockchain, I'll just go ahead and say it cuts against the interests of the biggest validators in our blockchain. Some of them were okay with that and still voted for the option that cut against their economic interests. Many of them voted against that option, but that option still won. The K to 1,000 min pool cost to 170 option still won, no matter how you count it. People were pointing out today that no matter how you count it, K to 1,000 min pool cost to 170 still won. If you count it by pool stake, it won. If you count it by number of pools, it won big time. If you count it by declared pledge, it won. If you count by number of delegators, it won. If you count by number of SPOs, it won by a gigantic margin. Look at this, 308 to the next option, 154. Huge margin up here too by number of pools, 364 to 189. Increase K to 1,000, have min pool cost to 170 was a huge winner. And we had exactly 795 pools voting according to this, almost 800 pools. That's incredible. 10.8 billion in stake. This is pretty incredible. Number of delegators also incredible. 628,668 delegators represented by these pools that were voting. This is incredible. You would assume in crypto, if there's money on the line, the large holders will often get their way. And we can say that the multi-poolers are generally large holders of Cardano's ADA. They tend to have a lot of ADA. And they didn't really get their way here. In fact, a lot of them even voted for decentralization. Much credit to those multi-poolers who voted for the decentralization option. I think it's very commendable. And we saw some very significant multi-poolers vote for that option, which, probably saved the day in some respects. So thank you again to some of those large multi-poolers who voted for this option. But I think this really goes to the thinking of the Cardano community. And crypto is full of extraction and hacks and rug pulls and scams, just people at each other's throats trying to extract as much money as possible from crypto. And here what we're seeing is an entire community of people, a huge, gigantic community of people to the tune of 628,668 people represented by these stake pools. And together as a community, they voted not to do the short-term extraction thing, not to maximize the revenue of these stake pools in the short term, instead to try to make the Cardano ecosystem as valuable as possible in the long term by shooting for as much decentralization as we can, by being the most decentralized big blockchain. We are already the most decentralized, and we're going to keep it that way because the community understands the value of decentralization. And when we have votes like this, the amazing part is this phase of the Cardano Foundation's poll was just for the stake pools, but for the stake pool operators, but there was enough pressure on the stake pool operators that the vote still came out in favor of decentralization. And granted, there's been some redelegation. There's been pretty significant redelegation. It might have just been the redelegation that pushed us ahead by some counts, like this pool stake count. I'm guessing, it might have just been the redelegation that pushed us ahead here. But there's actually a little bit more we can do in terms of redelegation. So if we isolate the individual variables, I think this is significant because people will look at this data. And what's going to happen with the data from this poll is it's going to go to the Cardano Foundation and Emergo and IOG, and they're going to take it as a suggestion as they decide what to do with these parameters. Because by Q3 of this year, we won't quite be in the Voltaire era unless a whole lot happens in between now and then. I think it's unlikely we'll actually be in the full Voltaire era where something like SIP 1694 is active. We probably won't be there yet. So we've got the 3 founding entities. We're going to make this decision about these parameters. And they're going to look at, I think, all the data, including when you break out these individual parameters here. So what we see is going by number of SPOs, 170 min pool cost and K to 1,000, destroying the other options. Same thing by number of delegators. 170 is destroying 340, K to 1,000 slightly ahead of K at 500. Declared pledge, same thing, 170 and 1,000. By number of pools, destruction, 170 killing 340, 1,000 straight murdering 500. But when we come over here to answers by pool stake, which is significant, we find 170 is beating 340, but K to 1,000 is lagging just slightly behind Keep K at 500. And here's where we can still do some work with the redelegation. I know some of you were waiting for today because today will be after the epic ends, meaning we've come to the conclusion of the SPO phase of this Cardano Foundation poll. We're now officially in the redelegation phase, and a lot of people have already redelegated. But if you've been waiting to see if your stake pool would vote, your stake pool's chance to vote is over now. If they haven't voted, it's because either they couldn't upgrade to a node that allowed them to, or to a version of the node that allowed them to vote, or they couldn't vote for some other reason, or they just chose not to vote, or they didn't want to vote because they didn't want their delegators to know what their position was on these parameters. But in any case, if your stake pool was going to vote, they would have done it by now. Their time to vote is over. So now you've got all the information you need to decide if you should redelegate. And if you believe that K to 1,000 is better for decentralization than K at 500, and your stake pool voted for K at 500, or maybe they didn't vote and you're not okay with that, now's the time to redelegate 2K to 1,000 if that's what you believe in. If you believe that that helps decentralization, you should redelegate to a pool that voted for that option, because it's possible we could still push. This is the only place where the options for decentralization didn't win, where one of the two parameters didn't come out in favor of decentralization, just in answers by pool stake when you isolate this parameter. Again, when we go back to the straight options, both the parameters combined, K to 1,000 and min pool cost to 170 still won. But isolate the parameters and increase K to 1,000 is lagging slightly behind K at 500. So if you believe K to 1,000 is better for decentralization and your pool did not vote that way, now is the time to redelegate. It's really easy. Just come in here. I've said this before, but just come in here. I'll put the link down in the description box. It'll be there tonight. I know last night I missed it for a second, and then I put it in there later when somebody pointed it out. Several people pointed it out, but it'll be there tonight. Come here, filter by ticker. Just put in the ticker of your stake pool. Hit search. It'll show you how your stake pool voted. If they didn't vote for K to 1,000 and you believe in K to 1,000, then now's the time to redelegate. So a few people have asked me, what is the argument for K to 1,000? And there are a lot of different ways you could approach this issue, but I'm going to show you one aspect of this discussion that some people may have been overlooking. So we've got these two parameters, K and min pool cost. And the goal is obviously decentralization. People could disagree about how to define decentralization. They might choose to measure decentralization differently. And this is the whole purpose of the Edinburgh Decentralization Index. They're going to try to standardize how we measure decentralization. But in the meantime, one thing I think we can say is that if you're in the blockchain world, you don't want your blockchain to get 51% attacked. And the way you make it very difficult for someone to execute a 51% attack is by decentralizing your blockchain in this sense. You try to make it so that there are as many parties as possible required for a 51% attack. And this number in Ethereum and Bitcoin is low single digits. They have very bad decentralization. In Cardano, we're much better. But obviously, we want to be as decentralized as possible. So for purposes of something like a 51% attack, we want this minimum attack vector, this MAV, to include as many parties as possible. So going back to our two parameters, we've got min pool cost. And if we cut min pool cost in half, we go from 340 to 170, that diminishes the incentive going forward for parties to open up new pools. Like if you're a single pool operator, you have a smaller incentive to open up a second pool because you're only going to get 170 in min pool cost as opposed to 340. And if you're already a multi-pooler, you'll have less of an incentive to open up yet another pool. But that doesn't really affect all the delegation that's already in these multi-pools in the MAV. These are multi-poolers in this MAV, and they've got a lot of delegation. But what would affect that delegation is if they had a huge incentive to redelegate. So we all know that delegation in Cardano is pretty sticky. Like people often just set it and forget it. They'll delegate to a pool and then they're not really going to think about it again. They can't be bothered in the name of decentralization to redelegate, which is understandable. People have lives, they got things going on. They are just going to delegate, and many of them won't even think about it unless they have a big incentive to redelegate. And K provides us with a possible incentive there. That incentive is that if K moves from 500 to 1,000, it basically cuts the saturation threshold of all these pools in half. So if you've currently got a saturation threshold somewhere around 70 or 71 million, then you would go down to a saturation threshold around 35 million. So we've got a great tool to incentivize people in the MAV to redelegate as long as they're in a pool that's over 35 million. If they're in a pool that's over 35 million, then the delegation above that threshold, if K goes to 1,000, is going to want to redelegate. Some amount of the delegators, the amount over 35 million, is going to want to redelegate. So obviously it won't be exactly 35 million because we're issuing new ADA all the time in the form of block rewards. And by Q3, when all this possibly goes down, it's going to be a different number. But if it happened today, somewhere around 35 million. So there's two questions here. Where will they redelegate? So none of this matters if you think every single one of those delegators who's above 30 in a pool that's above 35 million, if you think every single one of them will just redelegate to another pool inside the MAV, then none of this matters. I think that's unlikely. I think some of them, of course, will just redelegate to another pool inside the MAV, but some of them will also redelegate outside of the MAV, which is going to push delegation away from this group of pools, which is going to make the minimum, it's going to mean more parties required for the minimum attack vector, more parties required to get to 51%. That's an increase in the decentralization of our blockchain ecosystem. That's why K equals 1,000 is going to decentralize Cardano. But there's another question. So that's the first question. Where will they redelegate to? The other question is, how many pools are we talking about here? Because obviously there's going to be some pools above 35 million in here, and there's going to be some below 35 million. Let me show you. So I just went through and counted. I eyeballed it. I went through and tried to find all the pools in the MAV that are currently over 35 million. And there are a lot of them. There are 100. And I know some of you are jumping up to tender your objection. Yeah, but the MAV includes, centralized exchanges. And those centralized exchanges, they're just going to rebalance their pools. They're not even going to give the delegators a chance to redelegate anywhere because their money is deposited at that centralized exchange. That's true, but that 100 number, it doesn't count them. For the 100 number, I didn't count the centralized exchanges. I didn't count some of the wallet providers that have kind of some captive delegation. We've got Exodus and Adalite. We've got eToro and Coinbase. I also didn't count some of the I didn't count the founding entity pools like IOG and Emergo because they might have private pools. Even Wave Financial seems to have private pools. So I didn't count the pools of theirs that have 100% margin, which means that no one from the public is likely to be delegating there. If you count all of those pools, you get a number that's 177 above the saturation threshold. But even excluding those at 100, you've got a huge amount of delegation in pools that will be above saturation. So obviously only an amount of delegation above that saturation threshold, which today would be like 35 million, only that amount is going to redelegate. Still, that's a huge amount. That's a huge amount. So the only way this isn't going to push delegation away from the MAV is if you think all these people redelegating in all these pools, if you think they're just going to redelegate back inside the MAV, if you think 100% of them are going to redelegate back inside the MAV, I think that's highly unlikely. The other objection you might have is, hey, there are a lot of pools outside of the MAV that will also be saturated, so we'll have some redelegation going on there. That is true, but I think it's unlikely that all those people in pools outside the MAV are going to, delegate back over to the MAV. I think the people who are in single pools right now, I think it's unlikely that a huge number of them are going to redelegate from single pools into the MAV. So I think these two scenarios are not the most likely, but I think we are going to see some people who are redelegating. Because I mean, a lot of people have been delegated the same pool for a long time. Delegation in Cardano is pretty sticky, and there are going to be a lot of them who will have been subject to a lot of the discussion and thinking and education around decentralization and our Nakamoto coefficient and our minimum attack vector. People will have experienced those discussions. They'll have been exposed to all that now. Whereas when they first delegated to a lot of these pools, they may not have. They may have been delegated to these pools for quite a while. And it might have been before we had all the discussions about decentralization and all of these things. So I think you're going to see some of these delegators delegating outside the MAV, which is why I think K going to 1,000 is important. And all of that just addresses the amount of delegation inside the MAV. We've also got all these multi-pools in here that are outside of the MAV. And then we've also got the gigantic group of single pool operators. And even with the single pool operators, this will operate in these multi-pool operators outside the MAV, but also in these single pool operators. We've got a lot of pools that are going to be above 35 million. And if the threshold drops to 35 million, people are going to have to redelegate. So you won't have as much delegation concentrated in these larger single pools. That's going to get spread out to and I think probably a lot of other single pool operators. So I think if you're delegating to a single pool operator, that might be part of the reason that they're a single pool operator. And if you have to redelegate because the threshold gets cut in half, you're probably going to delegate to another single pool operator, another solo operator, as this chart puts it. And that's going to even out the delegation in here and make it easier for some of those other single pool operators who may have lower stake to survive, because in order for their stake pools to be sustainable, they have to have a certain amount of delegation. So it's better for us to have, a stake pool of 35 million and then have the other 35 million delegated out to a bunch of those other single pool operators so that they can survive. What about some of these other parameters? We've heard a lot of talk about A naught, which is pledge influence, and some idea of a minimum margin fee. So starting with pledge influence. You mean you want to increase pledge influence, which would make it easier for rich guys to run stake pools than non-rich guys. That sounds terrible. This is a horrible idea. Not only does it cut against one of the central fundamental premises of Cardano, that we're trying to create a more level economic playing field for the world, it totally cuts against that. Like, no part of that is consistent with, let's make it easier for the rich guys to participate in our system, our ecosystem, than the non-rich guys. No part of that is consistent. It'll also make it harder to onboard the most new stake pool operators. If I was a new stake pool operator and I heard, by the way, Cardano just increased their pledge influence parameter, so now it's even harder for you to run a stake pool compare as a non-rich guy compared to the rich guys. I'd be like, yeah, I'm going to choose a different ecosystem. I'm going to go somewhere else. That's going to make it harder for us to onboard the non-rich guy stake pool operators, which are going to far outnumber the rich guy stake pool operators. This just smacks of elitism. We don't want to make it harder in our ecosystem for normal people to compete with the rich people, the ADA rich people, when it comes to operating a stake pool. Blockchains work best when things are permissionless, and certainly there are already startup costs, and A naught is a parameter. So it's already a steep enough curve for new stake pool operators to get beyond. We don't want to add this, increase the factor that sort of, disadvantages normal people versus the well-heeled ADA rich guys. This is like a terrible idea. It's like it'd be the opposite of good PR if that's the direction we went in. Then you've got minMargin. So I think we can say pretty much as a repeating historical experience, humans have found out that free markets do a much better job of price discovery than central planning of prices. Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market does a much better job at price discovery than central planners do. The whole Soviet experiment kind of proved this to us versus the free markets of the West. The free markets of the West vastly outperformed the Soviet markets over the long run, because the invisible hand is much better at price discovery than a bunch of bureaucrats who just say, oh, we're going to have a min pool cost of 340. Oh, we're going to have a min margin of 2%. You just let the free markets take care of themselves. You tell people they can set their margin as low as they want. They can set their min pool cost as low as they want. And the free markets will make those demand and supply curves match up at the right price point. The free markets will find the price. If you artificially try to set prices, what you get are market inefficiencies, and those markets are outperformed by free markets. We need to be as competitive as possible in Cardano. We don't want to do the Soviet thing where we do centralized price planning. We want to do the free market thing because it's much more efficient. It produces much more optimal outcomes. So I don't think we want this increase in pledge influence. That'll certainly benefit the guys who have a lot of ADA, and I noticed that they're usually the ones who are pushing for that. We don't want to advantage them over the non-rich guys, and I think we want to go in the direction of free markets. Let Adam Smith's invisible hand do its thing, because that almost always creates the more optimal outcome. No matter how you feel about the individual parameters, you've got to agree that this is amazing. The fact that the Cardano community voted in favor of the decentralization option, and not just the entire Cardano community, it was the entire Cardano community via their stake pool operators. The stake pool operators themselves voted more for increasing K to 1,000 and cutting min pool cost in half, even though it means a lot of stake pool operators will make less money. They're actually, a lot of them are voting in favor of something that means they will make less money. They're taking money out of their own pockets. A lot of them voted that way. And, there has been a certain amount of redelegation. So a lot of stake pool operators voted for some of these options, even this option, which is, from my perspective, definitely not a vote for decentralization, but enough people redelegated away from those stake pool operators. The powerful Cardano community understands the long-term vision of decentralization and how decentralization is what will make a blockchain ecosystem valuable. Enough people understood that in the powerful Cardano community that the vote came out the way it did. I am not at all convinced that this could have really happened in any other top 10 blockchain ecosystem. I don't think this could have happened in Bitcoin. You weren't going to see the miners voting to make less money. That wasn't going to happen. You weren't going to see the Ethereum stake pool operators voting to make less money. I don't think it could have happened in any other top 10 blockchain ecosystem. This could have only happened because of the powerful Cardano community. Good job, everybody. I hope you had a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.